Professor Valdres adjusted his holoprojector with practiced precision, the three-dimensional images of grotesque creatures materializing above the lecture hall floor. The Class 12 xenobiology students leaned forward in their anti-grav seats, equal parts fascinated and horrified by the display. Today, we study the apex predators of Kepler 442b, Valdres announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades cataloging the galaxy's most dangerous life forms. Also known as Terra Mortis, the Deathworld. In the third row, a student named Alex Chen kept perfectly still, maintaining the same expression of academic interest as his classmates. None of them knew that beneath his carefully crafted human appearance, primitive instincts, older than civilization itself, were stirring to life. The dominant species, Valdres continued, manipulating the hologram to show a bipedal creature with elongated limbs and predatory features, are the Kethmori. Note the chitinous exoskeleton, the retractable claws, and most importantly, the adaptive camouflage capabilities that allow them to mimic other species with frightening accuracy. Alex's enhanced metabolism remained steady, though every cell in his body recognized the image floating before the class. The professor had gotten some details wrong. The bone density was actually 40% higher than displayed, and the neural processing speed was being severely underestimated, but the basic structure was accurate enough to make Alex's borrowed human form feel suddenly constraining. These creatures, Valdres said with obvious distaste, represent everything we fear about uncontrolled evolution. They're apex hunters, incapable of higher reasoning, driven purely by territorial aggression and predatory instinct. A student named Maria raised her hand. "Professor, how do we know they can't think? I mean, if they can mimic other species?" Valdres waved dismissively. "Mimicry is instinctual, Miss Rodriguez. A chameleon can change colors, but that doesn't make it intelligent. The Kethmori are sophisticated biological machines, nothing more. Every expedition to Terra Mortis has resulted in complete loss of contact. They kill everything that enters their territory." Alex shifted slightly in his seat, remembering the exploration teams that had landed on his homeworld. The memory brought neither satisfaction nor regret, merely the cold recognition of necessity. The off-worlders had come with weapons drawn, speaking in aggressive tones about territorial surveys and resource extraction rights. In Kethmori culture, such behavior could only be interpreted one way, as a declaration of war. Their society, if we can call it that, Valdres continued, appears to be based entirely on dominance hierarchies and territorial disputes. They show no evidence of art, literature, or philosophical thought. They're essentially highly evolved animals. The professor's words stung more than Alex had expected. He thought of the song spirals that his people wove into their living architecture, complex mathematical poems that could take centuries to complete. He remembered the contemplation groves where elder Kethmori would spend decades in deep philosophical meditation, their thoughts moving in patterns too subtle for rapid-minded species to comprehend. "But Professor," another student interjected, "if they're so dangerous and primitive, how did they achieve interstellar capability?" Valdres frowned. "They haven't. Terra Mortis remains isolated, which is fortunate for the rest of the galaxy. The only reason we know anything about them is through long-range observation and analysis of crashed probe data." Alex's internal translator finally found an adequate human expression for what he was feeling: irony. Here he sat, having traveled light years from his homeworld, through technologies these academics couldn't begin to comprehend, listening to them describe his people as primitive savages who had never left their planet. The irony deepened when he considered why he was here. The Kethmori High Council had sent him to study the younger races, to understand their rapid, chaotic thinking patterns, and determine if peaceful coexistence was possible. His mission was essentially diplomatic reconnaissance, the kind of sophisticated political thinking that Professor Valdris claimed his species was incapable of. The most disturbing aspect of Keth Mori behavior, Valdris was saying, his hologram now showing what the professor claimed were territorial marking patterns, is their complete inability to recognize the sanctity of other forms of life. They view every non-Keth Mori entity as either prey or threat. Alex almost laughed at the absurdity. The markings Valdris was displaying as territorial boundaries were actually memorial garden sacred spaces where the Keth Mori honored the memory of all life that had passed through their world, including the exploration teams they had been forced to eliminate in self-defense. Professor Alex found himself saying, his voice carefully modulated to match human speech patterns, "Have there been any attempts at communication? Perhaps the hostility is based on misunderstanding." Valdris turned to look at him with mild surprise. "An interesting question, Mr. Chen. But communication requires a baseline intelligence capable of abstract thought. The Keth Mori operate on pure instinct. You might as well try to negotiate with a virus." The comparison was particularly galling because Alex knew that his people's concept of individual consciousness was fundamentally different from these younger species. Where humans saw discrete individuals, the Keth Mori experienced a form of collective awareness that maintained personal identity while sharing deeper philosophical and emotional connections. To them, the human concept of isolated individual minds seemed tragically primitive. Besides, Valdris continued, their physiology makes them incompatible with civilized space. They require specific atmospheric conditions, gravitational constants, and dietary requirements that no space station or diplomatic vessel could accommodate. Alex breathed the recycled air of the space station and felt perfectly comfortable. His hybrid physiology adapted to function in any environment that could support human life. Another misconception to add to the growing list. As the lecture concluded and students began filing out of the hall, Alex remained in his seat, processing what he had learned. The younger races weren't evil or intentionally malicious. They were simply operating from a foundation of incomplete information and cultural assumptions that made true understanding nearly impossible. He activated his concealed communication device, sending a carefully encrypted message toward the edge of the star system, where a Keth Mori deep-range vessel waited in dimensional fold space. Initial assessment complete, he transmitted in the harmonic language of his people. Recommend continued observation. Species shows potential for growth, but first contact protocols must account for significant cognitive and perceptual differences. They fear us because they do not understand us, and they do not understand us because they cannot yet conceive of intelligence that operates differently from their own. Alex gathered his study materials and headed for the exit, passing Professor Valdris, who was still organizing his holographic displays. The professor nodded politely at his departing student, never realizing he had just spent an hour teaching one of the galaxy's supposed monsters about the supposed nature of his own species. As Alex walked through the corridors of the space station, he reflected on the delicate irony of his situation. He was here to determine if peaceful coexistence was possible between their species. After today's lecture, he was beginning to think it might be.